JaiBhim. Today, we are delighted to have you all join us for this year's Ambedkar lecture series for the month of May. ALS is dedicated to honoring the life and legacy of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, a visionary leader, a social reformer, and a champion of equality and justice. My name is Harita, and it is a pleasure to be today's ALS moderator. A little about the lecture series. In commemoration of Dr. Ambedkar's invaluable contributions, Boston Study Group has curated a series of lectures that explores various aspects of his life, work, and ideology. Our esteemed speakers at Ambedkar Lecture Series will delve into topics such as caste annihilation, constitutional rights, gender equality, education, economic justice, and Dalit empowerment, shedding light on the relevance of Dr. Ambedkar's teachings in today's context. A little about the Boston Study Group. The Boston Study Group is a non-profit organization registered with the IRS under 501(c)(3). Based in New England, USA, we are an Ambedkarite organization dedicated to creating a just and equitable society. We organize study groups, monthly meetings, lecture series, and other social activities in the Boston area to support our mission. Our members include individuals, families, students, scholars, academics, and workers who share our vision of equality and upliftment. We focus on creating support structures and working with students from historically marginalized backgrounds. We are inspired by figures who have worked for the human welfare from Buddha and Sant Ravidas to Savitri Bai and Jyotirao Phule, Periyar, and Dr. Ambedkar. Before we get started, a little today about our guest speaker. Jayaseelan Raj is an associate professor in anthropology and development at King's College London and a fellow of the GRNPP at SOAS University of London. He is the author of Plantation Crisis, Ruptures of Dalit Life in the Indian Tea Belt, and co-author of Ground Down by Growth, Tribe, Caste, Class, and Inequality in 21st Century India. His research and writings examine themes such as plantation system and labor, caste, class, gender and ethnicity, agrarian capitalism and migration, as well as the state and Dalit question in India. To ensure that everybody has an accommodation, we are going to mute until the speaker finishes the discussion. It is going to be a 45-minute session followed by a Q&A session. If you have any questions, you can drop it in the chat. Once the session is over, we can take up the questions. Um, Welcome, Jayaseelan Raj, today. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for the invitation, Mr. Sanjay Bhagat, other members of Boston Study Group, and thanks, Harita, for the generous introduction. So, what I would like to discuss today is on an important exercise. It may looks a bit simple. It is actually a simple exercise, but I think it's an important one for anyone who is thinking about Ambedkarite thoughts, Ambedkarite politics, anti-caste activism, etc. So it's the particular focus is on how Ambedkar thought about different categories in his analysis of caste system, anti-caste politics, and possible ways through which emancipation could be achieved. So I would like to discuss the categories that he employed, coined, invented, tailored, to discuss human emancipation. And I would like to stress little bit on the idea of autonomy, which I think was central to Ambedkarite politics. Um, in relation to the categories that he has been working with. So, and I would like to also highlight why it is important to think about these categories very specific to the way Ambedkar used it. And there are many reasons. I would like to also give that sort of rationale for the significance of it before I move on to discuss the way Ambedkar thought about the categories, particularly of caste, class, and race. Um, so, why we need to pay attention to Ambedkar's category? I think the foremost factor is that his categories were distinct given his ideas, given his training in India and abroad, and also his encounter with Indian society and polity of his time. So the most important thing is that it's so distinctive. And we would look at how that is distinct from the way others talk about, for example, caste or class. So rather than situating Ambedkar's thought within theories outside, one should pay attention to also what is the logic and kind of epistemological history within which Ambedkar's thought emerged. So now, even when people pay attention to specific aspects of Ambedkar's thought, because we have like huge scholarship on Ambedkarite thoughts these days, but even then, what happen is when they compare it with others, they overlook the specific aspects of his categories. So another case in point with regard to Ambedkar's thought, while he inspires different kinds of struggle, Ambedkarite thoughts are appropriated into political ideologies with with flimsy background. For example, the attempt to incorporate Ambedkar into the sort of Hindu majority and discourse, which is in any way an irony given his critique of Hindu order, his critique of Hindu order forms central to his political thought and social theory. Paying attention to Ambedkar's categories is also important, especially given his recent critique of Ambedkar's thought and politics, which is, I think, made possible because the categories used to criticize Ambedkar is borrowed from others, often which looks very white or Brahminical, but often projected as radical thought, therefore escaping explicit capture or understanding of them as conservative. So we'll be able to capture these sort of conservative aspects of the critique only if we pay attention to the specific aspects of Ambedkar's thought. So to give a very brief example, on the discussion on class, the idea is always to look for how Karl Marx or Max Weber have defined class, or how the Marxist or Weberian discourse on class capture the occupational or social class aspects. But when it comes to India, rather than just focusing on a very dominant Marxian or Weberian framework, it's important to pay attention to how Ambedkar understood class as something that is located within moral universe of caste ideology. So that's very important to understand the way class is understood by Ambedkar, because this is not the class that is often discussed by the Marxist or Weberian. So, in that sense, the challenge is not just in bringing together, for example, the Marxist and Ambedkarites to the table in taking caste and class seriously, or for working towards an anti-caste and class struggle. But an important aspect in this regard is to understand what do we mean by class in the Indian context. How does class operate? How does its specific history looks when we look at them from an understanding of class? that is highly sensitive to the caste question, right? So often, Ambedkarite movements are projected as identity-based movements who are not sensitive to class struggle, but that particular kind of critique is made possible by a particular analysis of class that is not sensitive to the caste question. So if an understanding of class that is sensitive to the caste question, they would understand that an anti-caste struggle has been consistently a class struggle as well, but not in the way that is imagined by a conservative or conventional approach to class struggle. And also, what we see recently from critiques who are mostly upper caste, but also there are um, Dalit or Ambedkarite scholars who make very who make critiques of Ambedkar, for example, as something who have been taken class seriously, or to criticize Ambedkarites as just people who are interested in performative aspects of celebrating Ambedkar's birth anniversary without looking into his radical thought. So that sort of debate is also set within what I would call as a sort of a mainstream upper caste intellectual circle, often set by the non-Dalit. So what happen often is Ambedkarites are forced to engage in a terrain, even in an intellectual debate, set by people who are not from an Ambedkarite background. So often what happens is that the discourse itself is set by them, so that it doesn't escape the political intellectual discourse that is already Brahminical. So they often fall prey to what they accuse of. So you can have an anti-caste discourse, but still being very casteist, that is not often realized. Um, so what happens is we have these sort of intellectual terrain, even in critical scholarship, which still appears to be very much what I would call as a Brahminical imagination, and studies even not only on anything related to caste, but even the debates explicitly tied to anti-caste often comes from that sort of a Brahminical imagination, to suggest how, for example, Dalit scholars should write, how Dalit scholars should do research, and how they should embrace the particular kind of radicalness as stipulated and monitored by the upper caste intellectuals. So therefore, again, it's so important that we go back to the categories of Baba Saheb Ambedkar. So I'll just give you a very brief example for this particular sort of intellectual circle set by non-Dalit scholars. So I just take the example of two important sociologists of India, M.N. Srinivas and Andre Bethe. So M.N. Srinivas, as we know, came up with many ideas. The most popular ones are dominant caste and Sanskritization. He also coined Vote Bank, among other concepts. But one thing, if we pay attention to M.N. Srinivas's theory, what is in it for Dalits, what is in it for anti-caste politics, we do often find that M.N. Srinivas talk about caste without talking about Dalits. But he explicitly stated in many contexts that, for example, the idea of dominant caste is not applicable to Dalits, because even in contexts where Dalits are majority numerically, they won't be able to become a dominant caste. So in context when they are not numerically dominant, they won't be able to negotiate power position or status position with dominant caste in that area, because they don't have the ritual status as upper caste, who might be able to negotiate their power position even if they are not numerically dominant. because of their status within India's caste system. He makes it very clear. In with the concept of Sanskritization also, he makes it very clear that even if Dalits emulate upper caste practices, they won't be able to achieve higher status. So the concepts, the kind of processes M.N. Srinivas discuss in relation to caste has nothing to do with Dalit life or Dalit realities. And even then, M.N. Srinivas is considered as the most important scholar. He is an important scholar, but despite the fact that he overlooks an important perspective in understanding caste system, he is still considered as someone who is the sort of last word in understanding caste in India. But this is not my original critique. The original critique comes from C. Parvathamma, who wrote an important article in 1978 highlighting the fact that Aman Srinivas's identity of being an upper caste Brahmin male doesn't allow him to look at certain kind of realities. But even then, the important point is that that privilege allows I allowed M.N. Srinivas to claim it as a very general, generic reality for India. So that's very important point, that one can still overlook certain realities, but still make it looks like a very general story. And that is very much a caste privilege. So when it comes to Andre Bete, who is another important sociologist from India, Andre Bete has discussed, Andre Bete, I think in 1972, if I remember correctly, gives a lecture on social justice and social justice leaders from India. In that lecture given in the University of Cambridge, Andre Bete never mentions Ambedkar in the lecture, quite surprising. But later, Andre Bete takes positions with regard to the question of race and caste in the 80s, which is very different from the 90s. So what happens in the 80s when scholars argue, particularly scholars from European universities, mainly Louis Dumont, who makes an argument that caste is very distinctive. Indian society is a very hierarchical society. But then Andre Bete comes up, Andre Bete, along with few other upper caste scholars, comes up with a critique of Dumont, arguing that caste is another form of hierarchy, just like in any other society. So caste is nothing, caste is not special. So India also has egalitarian relations, context, which needs to be taken into account. So in England, it is class. In America, it may be race. In India, it is caste. So that's a sort of an argument put forward by Andre Bete. But in early 2000, when Ambedkarite and caste scholars make an attempt to make caste as a category that is comparable to racial discrimination in international forum, in the UN conference on anti-racism, xenophobia, what happens is Andre Bete writes again, just flipping his own point. Andre Bete argues that caste is very specific. Caste cannot be compared to race, which is just opposite to the way he was making which in just opposite to the way he argued in the 80s. So what happens is you find these very big dions in Indian sociology and sociology of caste in particular, making changing positions depends on the political necessity of a conservative upper caste nationalist state. um, and they are often not and also with certain kind of impunity, right? So that brings to the question of positionality of upper caste academics who specialize on India, um, but um, the positionality of upper caste academics are not at all discussed within Indian academia or in a global academia. And this is a major problem because you find the upper caste Indian scholars outside India are leading the discussion on positionality and identity of intellect and how identity, social experience, economic position of individuals affect the way they do research, affect the way they collect data, and affect the way they make arguments. But when it comes to India, the same uh, scholars doesn't say anything about their position. Okay. And the side effect is that the consequence is that most of the time these are projected as very progressive politics. So, for example, if you look at the entire post-colonial theory of particularly from the South Asian scholars who are in universities such as Columbia University, where Ambedkar studied, you would find that the lead discussion on post-colonialism appears to be very radical, but doesn't say anything useful on caste, except to say that caste is a colonial category. And um, again, the consequence of that is that there is a particular appropriation of discussions on caste, but also anti-caste politics in such a way that is detrimental to real anti-caste activism on ground. So you would still find people who talk about caste, but evade questions about certain questions about caste. So you'd find special issues, you would find a lot of workshops, discussions on caste without mentioning anything on Dalits or Brahmins. Mostly the discussions would be around middle caste, but also on Dalit experience discussed by upper caste scholars. And you can still talk about Dalit situations without talking about caste. And that's also made possible because they set up the agendas, they set up the intellectual table where where whatever they say would sound like very radical, right? And that's where we had to see Ambedkar's epistemology as something contradictory to the epistemology of upper caste, even when it comes to the question of caste, even when it comes to the critical scholarship. And sometimes you find scholars studying Dalit, but just will reduce it to the experience of Dalits, but taking the Dalit ideas and the experience of Dalits, but will project it into a sort of their own prism. So, what I meant by that is that decoloniality or discourse around post-colonialism is not something that is so central within in Indian university academia. Where there are discussions on, for example, de-Brahmanizing Indian academia, but often the concepts or the sort of larger analytical discussions from India is not taken outside India. But what is taken is a particular kind of empirical material and quoted with the theories externally that um, serves their own intellectual politics in their own specific regions, mostly within Euro-American universities. So, for example, on the discourse around post-colonialism, or what we are having discourse around decolonizing. Um, so, these aspects make it very compelling that we go back and look at what was Ambedkar's categories, where I tried to capture some of them in my previous writings. For example, I talked something called categorical oppression, where I pay attention to how categories of identity are formed from the local realities away from the categories of identity as assumed from the top. And this is so important that we need to understand there is always a set of major categories and minor categories. So major categories are categories like class, gender, or even caste in the way it is understood within the sort of larger scholarship, academia, which exist outside the realities of rural villages in India. Or one could look at what is so specific about caste or class or gender relationships in those contexts within rural India, and then come back and also pay attention to what are the categories that emerge from the ground. So you can also invent categories from the ground. And if you actually go back to Baba Saheb, Dr. Ambedkar, what you find is this attention to what I would call as a holistic approach in understanding categories, um, because Baba Saheb pays attention to not just economic question, he pays attention to the economic, social, and political aspects of caste and oppression in his analysis. So that is one kind of holism in Ambedkar's thought. And the second one is Ambedkar takes not only history seriously, but he also takes mythologies very, very seriously, and also pays attention to the contemporary realities of his time. So if we look at the scholarships on Ambedkar, we would find that that's why Ambedkar could be easily called as an economist, as a historian, as a sociologist, as an anthropologist. It is all made possible because Ambedkar paid attention to everything in relation to caste, but always not just taken away by the larger categories given to him from the text, but he always qualified those categories with specific experience on India. So this is another important holistic aspect of holism in Baba Sahib. So let me come to a bit of discussions on what are the how these specific categories emerge within Ambedkar's writings, particularly with reference to a few texts. One is, of course, the most popular one, 1916 paper Caste in India, Their Mechanism, Genesis, and Development, which he delivered in Department of Anthropology, Columbia University. And if you read the paper carefully with regard to this question of attention to specificity of categories, what we get is Ambedkar looks at what are the sort of possible way of understanding caste, right? Understanding caste through the lens of race, particularly, and also understanding caste through the lens of class, right? So what Ambedkar does is he looks at the question of caste and say that no, this is not quite will fit with your comparison of race because caste is specific in these aspects, but also it won't fit within a sort of symbol class analysis because it is so specific. It is a specific form of class, and why that is the case and how that is the case. And this is what we get from that particular piece. But it doesn't mean that Ambedkar doesn't pay attention to um, possibilities of comparing it with race or comparing to a class context. So somehow some scholars would object to projecting that sort of comparison, but Ambedkar was never against comparing to different kinds of realities, different kinds of hierarchies and oppression. He was very much interested in comparing different kinds of oppression. So, for example, in annihilation of caste. And Baker looks at, can caste be can caste society, caste-based society could be understood through the lens of class, and he qualifies on why certain things can be, particularly as a sort of critique of Gandhi. He looks at why caste society is the most horrible and inhuman society in the world. And in the text, Buddha or Karl Marx, Ambedkar again brings the question of question of categories of class and caste, and within, particularly with regard to the Indian experience, Ambedkar looks at either Buddhist or Marxian principles offer a better way out. So Ambedkar is still interested in looking at categories in a comparable sense. But before we jump to the comparability of categories, one needs to specifically understand what those categories are. And this is very important, particularly with regard to caste question. And for example, in the text, in the 1916 paper, you find very interesting, very interesting, very thoughtful sentences. So, for example, caste exists only as a relation to each other as a whole, not in singular number. Now, it may look like one statement, but that explains what caste, specificity of caste, and it define when it says as a whole. And again, Ambedkar understand it as a very a structural, holistic, large ideology influenced. I am very sensitive to caste ideology kind of society compared to, for example, class, where you may have different kinds of different groups located in relation to each other, but not in the way communities are related to each other in caste, which is again, of course, we often cite the sacred, sort of religious dimensions of caste as a system. And again, he cites as caste as a rigid self-enclosed unit, and doesn't have the sort of open door character of the class system. And this is again specifying how caste looks like, right? But this is one aspect of it. But again, what how we need to read this particular kind of text is also not just simply reducing it to understanding of caste, but also how class society looks like in India. So class society in India doesn't look like the class society of England, right? And because it's very much sensitive to the caste society, right? Um, and and that is very important before we just jump on to make solidarities with different kinds of struggle, because different kinds of struggle could mean different things unless we pay attention to what these specific struggles are aimed for. In Annihilation of Caste, Ambedkar again brings the different again, like the holism of social, political, and economic is highly evident in this particular text, where Ambedkar points again, stresses on the point that the political and economic is encompassed by the social in India, where Ambedkar argues that social reform was put on hold in India, struggle for independence. So where political reform is prioritized in on the in the context where social reform is put on hold. And Ambedkar explains why it needs to be questioned, it needs to be challenged, because the political is again very much encompassed by the social. Now, one would say that this could be applicable to any society. Perhaps that may be the case, but why it is very important to understand in India, in the Indian context, to stress on this point of social reform versus political reform, etc., is because caste is not just an identity category. Caste is not something people just could ascribe and choose or not to choose on certain context. Caste is something that defines other sort of major ideological system. So, for example, I mean, people talking about capitalism in India, They again would talk about the way caste is used, employed within Indian capitalism, rather than understanding this, the nature of capitalism in India is itself is highly informed. I'm not saying that it's absolutely in a rigid sense defined by caste, but highly informed by caste. So this is very important to go back and look at what these specific categories means. And in Annihilation of Caste, in the as well as in the text 1946 text, who were the Shudras, how they came to be the fourth Varna, as well as in 1948 text, and the untouchables, who were they and why they became untouchables. Ambedkar goes back to mythologies and and looks at critically mythologies in a way that and sometimes it's not taken very seriously by contemporary scholars, because after all they are mythologies. But Ambedkar consistently looks at mythologies because mythologies inform the way we interpret religion, the way we interpret imagined history, and therefore the way we understand what is caste and what are the values of caste. And therefore, going back to again the point I mentioned earlier about how Ambedkar pays attention not only just to economic or political or historical aspects, but also to also to the way human beings in general understood their own history, which is defined in terms of caste. And I think I have taken yeah, on maybe around 10 minutes left, I think. So I just wanted to come back to the question of autonomy, um, where I just want to highlight few points in relation to why we need to pay attention to Ambedkar's category and his stress on the idea of autonomy. And I may stop there, then take questions. So for me, Ambedkar was not against discussing or talking about the question of development and what we call as development today. But of course, Ambedkar has a much richer and a very elegant and a very humanist approach to questioning, challenging human oppression. Because for Ambedkar, the development or prosperity is not only um, tied to accumulation of wealth or accumulation of positions, but in cultivating an emancipatory mind, emphasizing on very progressive values, ultimately focusing on radical humanism. So Ambedkar situates the struggle for emancipation through keeping this sort of struggle for autonomy at the center. So autonomy as something that makes individuals possible to have their own choices, of course, while respecting other choices. And this is a very crude way of putting autonomy. But there is, of course, we do have a very larger discussion on autonomy in political philosophy, in feminist studies, focusing on autonomy and gender. But this is something I think we need to go back, because when Ambedkar stresses on particular aspects of caste and what does it mean, Ambedkar is also thinking about where to attack, what to attack in what he calls a reclaiming human personality. So the way he situates categories and relationship among human beings in different contexts, and he's emphasizing on the social, is very much tied to autonomy. And one thing that we are, of course, we do talk about the way John Dewey, political philosopher from Columbia University, who was also teacher of Ambedkar, influenced Ambedkar's ideas of justice, on freedom, etc. There is a particular kind of connection perhaps we don't pay enough attention to, which is that sort of the modern welfare economics, as said by Amartya Sen, among others, is very closely tied to the ideas of John Dewey, his conception of justice, particularly. And so therefore there is a connection between the way Ambedkar think about autonomy and in the later period, the way questions of inequality, poverty are addressed in relation to human capabilities, which becomes a very important set of ideas that influenced the way institutionalized welfare system would go forward. We know the idea of Amartya Sen's capability approach, which is again tied to the idea of choice and an enhancement of capability. But sadly, Amartya Sen, although mentions caste in his writings, in a very generic way, caste or race, that sort of thing, he doesn't seriously engage with Ambedkar's thought, although in a couple of times, Amartya Sen has mentioned that Ambedkar has been very important for his scholarship, but we don't find traces, or I'm sorry if I missed where some of his writings where he mentions, but I tried to look at it, but I couldn't find anything in his mainstream scholarship, an engagement with Ambedkar's idea. Although Ambedkar could enrich questions of what constitute well-being, individual agency or social agencies or development itself. And that also brings to a question of what I would call as political life of development discourses and model in India. So, for example, Amartya Sen makes Kerala model popular, as he mentioned, and his discussion on capability and choice is very much influenced by experience in different regions of the world. Within India, he particularly mentions Kerala often, um, and he cites, for example, uh, public action, public movements from Kerala, including anti-caste movement, but he credits that to the communist parties, not to the anti-caste reforms led by Dalits. But just go back to the question of development experience, development models in the way they are discussed. You don't find Ambedkar's thought or Ambedkar's conception of autonomy seriously there. And why I think it is missing is because Ambedkar has an idea of well-being which is very much tied to anti-caste politics, but also very sensitive to experience of the ex-untouchable communities. But what happen often in these popularly quoted um, more discourses on development models, either Kerala development model or the Dravidian model of Tamil Nadu or the Gujarat model of very conservative Modi's Gujarat, you don't find any discussions around explicit discussions around Dalit situations, except to mention that Dalits are in fact an outlier. In some places you do find mention of Dalit experience, also discussions of anti-caste politics, particularly with regard to Tamil Nadu, because in Tamil Nadu the political scene is very much set by Dravidian anti-caste social justice rhetoric. But interestingly and paradoxically, in none of these, either progressive Tamil Nadu, Kerala state or the conservative progress of Gujarat, you don't find the Dalit experience and their reproduction of the reproduction of their oppressed life situation within the particular kind of development experience is not addressed, while they are also able to maintain a very progressive, critical image as states, regions, particularly I'm talking about Tamil Nadu and Kerala, as centers of social justice. and still they could also appropriate Ambedkar within this sort of discourse, precisely because they don't have to engage with the particular categories of Ambedkar. Rather, Ambedkar, not Ambedkar's thought, is appropriated in a very abstract, rudimentary anti-caste politics, which is very casteist in reality and in policy and in practice. So I think it's so important that we again go back all the time to the epistemologies and the categories of Ambedkar in addressing any particular kind of set of issues. And in the way, as I just cited on the question of autonomy, we'll be able to unpack paradoxes of claims, not only claims by conservative Brahminical Savarna politics, but also to critically engage with politics that claims to be progressive, rooted in social justice, and how all sort of politics reproduce a very caste society. Thank you so much.
Jayaseelan, thank you so much for today's talk. I think it was very insightful. We will open it up for questions, but before we do that, we want to ensure that everyone has an opportunity to participate in the discussion and that we stay within our allotted time frame. So we kindly ask you for your cooperation in keeping discussions concise and focused. If the conversation begins to prolong, I may need to gently steer it back on track or move forward to accommodate everyone's time. Thank you for your understanding and cooperation. Before we begin, I would like to have another announcement about the Awaken, the Boston Study Group's digital magazine. The Awakened is BSG's digital magazine that provides a platform for all Ambedkarites in the diaspora to share their stories, thoughts, views, and talents to enhance the Ambedkarite movement. We are looking forward to literary contributions for our future issues from Ambedkarites across the globe, including our young Ambedkarites. You can visit our website, bostonstudygroup.org, or you can email us. The details are also provided in the chat if in case it didn't get captured here. We can start with the questions if anyone has any.
Harita, there are two hands. Somaji is raised hand is first.
So if you can unmute and ask your question.
I congratulate Professor Jayaseelan and the Boston Study Group for this initiative. I'm from Tamil Nadu. Ever since Periyar published The Annihilation of Caste, Tamil Nadu has been in the forefront, as you all know. All parties and all caste people celebrate Ambedkar, and there are so many statues and institutions named after him. My question to you, Professor, is for the future. We have the Tamil brothers, they have Periyar Ambedkar societies in many places in USA, Canada, Australia, and other countries, even in London also. There's a young candidate, Ovia, she's also on the conference here. They're all doing what they can, but we have to guide them. In the United States, there are 5 Indian origin Congress people, 3 are Brahmins. We have to focus on the future to generate the interest in our young people, high school and colleges, to come into politics and journalism and other fields. And how do we guide them and help them to become a power to be in future? This is very important. As you know, the caste is a big problem here and in many countries where the Aryans have gone into. So my specific question is, can we start a program for the young people to get into other fields and focus on our Dravidian model in Tamil Nadu, as you said, to be a universal ideology? And I was very happy in Washington, D.C. when we unveiled the statue of Ambedkar, there are a plethora of very eminent people from all walks of life, but we all have to focus on bringing the young people into action. Can you answer that? Thank you very much.
Shall I respond, Harida, or should I take more questions?
Yes, yes. We will take one question each at a time.
Okay. Just quickly to respond to your statement, I mean, the I can only respond to the Tamil Nadu question. I didn't say that Dravidian model is a model to be emulated everywhere. I just merely pointed out the paradoxes and issues within those claims from anti-caste perspective that is sensitive to Dalit situation. So you can still be anti-caste. You can still claims to have anti-caste social justice, but still could be very caste. So Tamil Nadu is an example of very high violence against Dalits, a very high number and atrocities that one can look up online. But the question is, do we have to, I mean, and so we need to address those sort of concerns, unpack the paradoxes, rather than just merely be nationalistic when it comes to anti-caste claims by states, particularly, and a scholarship that support state hegemony of making claims of social justice while being very casteist. Thank you.
Thank you. Vishal, if you can unmute and ask a question.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Professor, for the nice talk. I have a question about last part of your talk that you have mentioned. The caste issues has not been addressed very carefully or in detail in Kerala or Tamil Nadu. We can understand why not in Gujarat. But in your opinion, why this has happened? Like why it's not been addressed or discussed in detail or at a forefront in Kerala and Tamil Nadu, despite their anti-caste model on paper? Could you please explain?
No, thank you. And that's a very important question for all of us. But I think specifically, you could cite a number of reasons. One is that precisely because of the hegemony of caste system, although in context we might have addressed certain kind of injustice, but it is still sort of reproduced within a caste society, and where where the state itself is casteist, but is not seen as casteist, and that's very dangerous.
So it's just on paper that we are working toward casteless society, but not actually in their. It doesn't reflect in their policy. Am I right?
They may have policies again in paper. I think the thing is to look at the empirical situation beyond sort of these sort of competing. So development models are not merely development models in a sort of economic terms. They are understood. They are sort of employed as part of politics proactively. So that's what I'm saying. It's very much tied to certain kind of nationalist, subnationalist sentiments within these states, which makes a claim of development as a sort of as part of producing an exceptional narrative about not only about the state but also about the culture, where Dalits are invisible within the story, and Dalits generate a crisis for the story, but therefore they are much more violently also pressed. Yeah.
Thank you.
We have a question in the chat from Kavya. So this is especially in the diaspora where Dalit Bahujan communities are engaging in anti-caste activism. What do you think about the politics of dominant caste Shudra communities also portraying themselves as oppressed vis-a-vis Brahmins emphasizing their historically oppressed caste identity and not together with class and their oppressor identity within the context of the Nayars of Kerala or Reddis of Andhra Pradesh, etc. Jayaseelan, I think you're on mute. We are not able to hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah.
I think that's a very important question. So particularly in Kerala and Tamil Nadu, the dominant caste politics is manifested right through class politics as well as Dravidian politics. But the dominant caste politics in South India in particular works differently from other regions, perhaps similarly. So when it comes to, for example, Maratha question in Maharashtra, you do find similarities with the politics in Kerala and Tamil Nadu, where you can still be opposed to Brahmins or sort of Brahmanical domination, but still you can reproduce the same sort of hegemony by employing caste. So that is again what one could call as anti-caste casteism, right? You are against casteism of certain kind, but not of others. So so that possibility is very much, that is not only a possibility, and that is a reality in Tamil Nadu and Kerala, where the intermediary caste could produce their political dominance by challenging Brahminical dominance, and they could reproduce their social dominance by oppressing Dalits. So within academic discourse, I think there are scholars, including me recently, critically engaging with this whole idea of silent revolution, democratic revolution in India, particularly focusing these sort of ideas, particularly focusing on how you had a very peaceful, non-violent transfer of power from Brahmins to other caste communities in the 80s particularly, but it doesn't actually tell us the fact that that silent revolution was very, very violent at the bottom, and that silent revolution was made possible by the violence against Dalits, because in order to have a sort of political movement at that level for intermediary caste groups, they need to have particular kind of accumulation, economic, political, and social, which was made possible by exploiting and expropriating Dalits. Right. I don't know if that answer your question, but it's a brilliant question. Thank you.
Thank you. Sanil, can I ask you to unmute to ask your question? Sanil, is there a question from your end? You've raised your hand.
I can't hear.
Yeah, he's trying to unmute, but again he
Okay.
gets muted. I don't know what is happening. So meanwhile, we can go to the Padma then. Oh, he again, yeah, same thing I'm observing. So you can go to the Padma's question if you want.
Okay. Yes, yes. The question is, the BCK has been integrating caste and class issues and working for the landless and the poor. This is very encouraging, and they wanted to hear your opinion on this.
No, that's good, right? If they are doing a good job, that's good. I think they are doing a good job. But in the sort of, if we pay attention to recent situation in Tamil Nadu, there are, some anti-caste scholars and activists are also concerned about what would be the sort of future of anti-caste politics, Dalit politics in Tamil Nadu in terms of alliances, because VCK is part of a DMK-led alliance, but still the state is very, very casteist. But I think VCK is doing a good job, and of course they have been instrumental in bringing together uh, Dalits and also in addressing caste and class question.
Thank you. Sanil, are you able to unmute, or we can move on to Venkat's question? Venkat, I think you can go ahead with the question.
Venkat, we can go to the next Nidish Sundar then.
Nidish, can you please unmute?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, Nidish.
Okay, thank you, Boston Study Group for organizing this event, and thank you, Jayaseelan Sir, for this interesting and wonderful talk. And I have a small question regarding scholars who are especially Dalit scholars and who are actually reducing Dalit politics and Ambedkarite politics into merely symbolic and performatic aspects, and which has been appreciated by the upper caste intellectuals and celebrated. And at the same time, state like Kerala, where the intellectuals who are affiliated to the institutionalized Communist Party are also appropriating these Dalit scholars to justify their, the way they overlook the caste question and reduce the questions addressed by Dalit movements. And my question is to actually, how do we kind of, confront, or how do we overcome these issues? Because the appropriability of Dalit scholars also, especially in regarding those who reduce Ambedkarite politics merely symbolic, also need to be addressed. Then how do we deal with this question? Yeah, I just would like to know your reflection on that. Thank you.
Thanks, Nidish. I think that's an important issue, right? I mean, when I started on the question of recent criticism leveled against Ambedkar, so if you look at, so of course you have given the Kerala case, and I totally agree with you. Just to give an example at a wider scale, is when you find these sort of criticism and you just look at what is sort of different connections to that criticism, in my view, where does it come from, and then easily you find people jumping on board into the debate. And I don't want to also sound like reducing possibilities of intellectual engagement. I think that's very, very important. Everybody has their own opinion. They can of course they have to write what they want, and of course anyone can critically engage with uh, Ambedkar, or Ambedkarite thoughts, or even Ambedkar's life. But the question is, how do they do that? And is it when they do it, was it fair? And on what grounds it is done? I think as academics, and of course in this particular moment we have people of different walks of life, but there are also academics. So for academics, I could simply suggest that we just pay attention to the way the scene is set, the discourse is set by very much an upper caste led intellectual platforms, so that we even in the even the days before or the days after the recent birth anniversary of Baba Sahib Ambedkar, you do find that sort of narrative. So and also we are not reducing everything to questions about identity of a non-Dalit or a non-Bahujan person, and that's not the agenda also, and I think that should not be the agenda. But one look at the way one could actually explain how their identity informs their arguments rather than just reducing everything to their identity. Although what you find often is that the sort of counter narrative when you question something like this, they would say, "Oh, someone questioning me because I'm not from that particular Dalit or a Bahujan community." That's a usual response you get, but I think it's so important to look at the epistemological context of their argument. And in Kerala also, I think that's possible, but it's unfortunate that that's not happening much. But within a sort of vernacular discourse, you do find a very proactive intellectual discourse in Kerala, which is very much challenging the sort of appropriation and domination.
Thank
Okay, Haritha, if I may go next.
Yes, Venkat.
Yeah, sorry, I couldn't unmute earlier when you called me. Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Professor Jayaseelan, for a nice talk. My question, we have finally the government has agreed to do this caste census, which I think is very, very, important. I think it will going to have a, something like more than Mandal type of effect on, uh, towards social justice and, understanding and, how the caste is playing a role in our socio-economic fabric of India, and accordingly, hopefully, there will be policies to mitigate those inequalities and wrong way of distribution of wealth and all that. So, question is, until British were there, they did the caste census, and when we got the independence, right? Uh, what was actually, I didn't know much. As a scholar, probably that is what I want to understand. What was Ambedkar's position on caste census and why it was not basically allowed, or, what dynamics that happened, post independent, they completely shunned doing that caste census. You can throw any light on that subject, it would be helpful. Okay. Thank you.
I'm not an expert on this particular topic, but
Yeah.
there are many people who are writing about the contemporary possible consequences of census. But I just want to sort of make a note of caution
Yeah.
that I think it all depends on what sort of data is collected, because when we talk about caste census, is it just merely about number or about inequality or other development indicators, and how the state is going to look at the data and how the state is going to make use of it. So the political climate of the 80s was very different, and the political climate today is very different. So there are concerns around how the sort of how, for example, BJP is going to make use of it or make a narrative um, on the census, but also on the, even to start with, on the process of census itself. And I'm an anthropologist, so I just want to highlight maybe one particular aspect with regard to historical anthropology of census in India and how census
Mm-hmm.
was seen. Because yes, you're right that census was very much part of during colonialism, and from the sort of early post-colonial days itself. We have scholars, activists who make this argument that census actually divide population. Census is something that it was used by the colonial state in making further division among different communities. And even scholars argued that census is the sort of very fundamental reason for caste division within India during colonial time. And the colonial state rediscovered caste as a tool for divide and policy, which they have implemented based on creating new categories through census. But then I think that is a very hugely problematic sort of approach where scholars, for example, there is a book by a historian called Nicholas Dirks called Caste of Mind, where he talks a lot about how even Ambedkar was caught up within this idea of census created by colonial state. And but I don't agree with that sort of criticism, because for me it is, census, simply a census can't divide people.
Correct.
So that's what would be my take as an anthropologist. But I just want to be very cautious about how do I respond to the possibilities which might look promising, but how the Sangh Parivar is going to make use of it is also a little bit worrying.
Yeah, so I may go, Harita. So what was, my important thing was because it was coming, right? I mean, it was whatever they were doing, why they stopped doing a caste. Was there a debate in Constitutional Assembly or Parliament about that topic? Because it is, for me, I think it's very, very fundamental. Caste is a socio-economic, political, cultural construct of India. Okay, that nobody can deny it. Only the dominant privileged people will deny that because they're deriving the privilege out of this status quo. So they don't want to really publish the numbers because they're tiny minority and owning majority of the wealth, positions, everything, right? So they don't want to, obviously. So the setting aside the dominant minority version, I mean, what was Ambedkar's position on the caste census? Because I am just curious to know, because he fought a lot of things he couldn't win. He wanted to nationalize the land. He couldn't to do so many different things. That time, heavily it's a Brahminical parliament and constitutional assembly didn't yield to, didn't allow most of his proposals. So if you know anything, please lay. Otherwise, that is what I was more interested. What was Ambedkar's position on the caste census when they first did it in independent India?
Again, of course, I'm not a historian,
Yeah,
but
that's fine.
I could just point out that if you look at the whole context of Pune Pact, Ambedkar
Mm-hmm.
was more oriented towards, he was less worried about the sort of division part, right? I mean, he was more for social justice, even if it if it generates or appears to generate certain kind of division. So I'm sure
Yeah.
in my reading, he would be okay with this. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Hey, Harita, you can take the Sanil's question I posted there.
Sanjay, I'm not able to see Sanal's question.
I sent to you, but if you want, I can just read his questions. He said, I would like to know Professor Jayaseelan's take on the debate on pragmatism and its impact on Baba Sahib Ambedkar. Professor Jay?
Yeah, I think that's an important question, and there are many scholars who are writing about the pragmatism and the way it has influenced Ambedkar's thought. And I think yeah, I would agree with that sort of debate and the argument particularly if comes from Scott, for example, recently wrote on that. For me, as I also mentioned in the lecture, that Ambedkar he's open to any ideas. For example, on the question of development, or on the question of capitalism, or for anything, Ambedkar would be open to ideas which could potentially provide emancipatory ways for Dalits in particular and other oppressed communities. Ambedkar would be less worried about overarching. Of course, Ambedkar was concerned about ideologies, but Ambedkar's understanding of ideology was in the way ideologies influence the way people think, rather than how ideologies itself is concerned about certain kind of narratives of possible human emancipation. So what I'm saying is, if you read Buddha or Karl Marx, you actually get a real good sense of what Ambedkar's approach to, for example, communist struggle, and in a very classic normative understanding of Marxian approach to emancipation, or a way for an egalitarian society. For Ambedkar, Ambedkar was not interested in something that looks like really far away from contemporary realities, which of course he was open to ideas, but Ambedkar was careful not to be short-sighted by certain overarching ideologies.
Thank you. I have another question on the chat from Govind. How do you see the gatekeeping of international academia by the historically privileged Varnas and its impact on the authentic Ambedkarite scholarship? How do you see the way out?
That's a huge question. I don't have a simple answer. What I was trying to do is also to explain how those privileges are reproduced. I think it is a struggle one needs to continually fight, but also, again, do our own part in questioning the way they construct knowledge, the way they come up with arguments which may look like critical, but nothing to do with realities from the ground. So just different kinds of struggle is very important to challenge that sort of domination. I don't have a way out. I don't have any particular thoughts on the way out. I think we all have to do the struggle, right? We participate in the struggle, and this platform is one of those, I think. Yeah, so we may need more of those.
Thank you. Can I ask Obia to unmute and ask the question?
Oh, yeah, surely. Thank you, Professor, for your wonderful session on a very important topic. My question is particularly about you spoke about category and epistemology, and how do we think women, particularly women from oppressed communities, as categories without essentializing them while still acknowledging their political and material importance. Consider you have a very vast and wider experiences on field, particularly uh, women, Dalit women who give a lot of labor and had a very different experiences on field in tea plantation and all that. How do you frame this viewpoint?
Thank you, Ovia. That's a very important question in relation to also what I have mentioned earlier as major categories or minor categories. I'm an anthropologist. So I try to do what many would call as grounded theory, to look for analytical possibilities from the ground rather than taking the theories as such upfront or carry the theories with me. But of course, we all have training as scholars who might be aligned with certain kind of ideological politics, intellectual politics on universities or in the wider community wherever you are engaging. But I think the simple point is to have commitment to the people about whom you are thinking and writing rather than to anyone else. So I don't have any commitment to Max Weber or Karl Marx or anyone. Of course, they help us in understanding empirical realities. But once we all become very much nationalistic about these theories and concepts, what would happen is we would just use the stories, as you mentioned, for example, Dalit women workers, for example, plantation workers, as a empirical case study to just illustrate whatever you want to illustrate. So to start with, we shouldn't have commitment to anyone else except the people we engage with. That's what would be my approach to start with.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Harita, if I may, just one comment.
Yes, Venkat.
Yeah, Professor Jayaseelan, about politics and, especially caste politics and, and the Dalits, okay, emancipation or empowering. You rightfully said the observations about Tamil Nadu and Kerala, where, everything was about this Dravidian ideology, anti-Brahmin, caste movement, but yet when the power is, achieved by so-called what we call, now technically today, you can call them OBCs or backward classes, right? Or but yet, Dalits are, at the receiving end, and these atrocities. I mean, socioeconomically they're better off, but you're right. Still, when it comes to these caste atrocities, is there no less? And unfortunately, same thing happens in North India, right? These Yadavs with the Mandalization come to power, but the situation of Dalits don't improve. That's a sad reality of the caste. So I mean, my take on that is, Dalit politics. I mean, there's no critical mass to achieve political power by just Dalits, and that's where the Kanshiram actually excelled, and how he knit a coalition of all these oppressed sections, but under Dalit leadership. I strongly believe that is the solution when you have Dalits leading and all other castes following. I mean, they're oppressed, but not to that extent. That is the solution. Will emancipate India and achieve. I mean, you never see Dalits doing anything bad to any other community. I mean, this is historically never ever you see that. So it's a sad reality where these intermediate castes come up, but they still do this. So that is what I strongly believe. But unfortunately, that movement is dying every day. So that's my comment. I mean, if you have any reflection, please, uh, you can reflect on that. Thank you.
I'll just take it as a comment. I think that's
Yeah,
a very important comment. Yeah.
yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I have one last question from the day the person wanted to be anonymous, but the question is around how do you see the impact of Marxian epistemic dominance in the academia on the analysis of caste with Ambedkarite epistemology?
Sorry, the question is.
I can repeat the question. How do you see the impact of Marxian epistemic dominance in the academia on the analysis of caste with Ambedkarite epistemology?
So how does Marxian epistemic dominance affect the caste analysis of Ambedkarites? Or again, I'm sorry, I didn't catch it quite well.
I think if I'm getting the overall question, is I think Marxism dominance in the academia on the analysis of caste in comparison again with the
Okay. Okay, with Ambedkarite approach.
Yes.
So, yeah, I mean, so this is perhaps that is also what I discussed, I suppose, is as a sort of empirical example to why one should go back to Ambedkar's specific aspects of approach to categories. Is one thing is so this sort of particular dominance of Marxian epistemology as the person asking question is that there is a misunderstanding of what is caste, what is class, and also on what is class struggle in relation to extending solidarity with anti-caste struggle, particularly against the Brahminical domination. So I think the major issue is on the confusion generated by what constitute class and caste as an academic, of course. I mean, in political impact, someone could enlighten me maybe more. But I think that's what you see, right? So when someone make a claim that Ambedkar didn't pay or Ambedkarites didn't pay attention to class question, they are able to make that sort of claim because of the dominance of this epistemology and this dominance of upper caste intellectual scene, which would appear to be very progressive and radical, but that is not the case, right? So what happens when someone make a claim that Ambedkarites didn't pay attention, for example, class struggle, it also goes by saying that Ambedkarite politics means identity politics. And this has been consistently pushed by Marxian epistemic dominance in India. So I think perhaps we need to question both at the level of scholarship and at the level of institutional dominance.
Thank you. We have one last question. We are almost at the end of the time. Satyanath, if you could unmute, and we request you to please keep the question brief as we are at the end of the time.
Unmute, yes. Yeah, actually, I just wanted to comment on the last but one question about Dalits taking the role of leadership or becoming the ruling class in India. Kanshiramji had mentioned sometime about becoming a ruling class or something, but he also mentions about always used to take a pen and as a totem pole and showing that Brahmins are at the top and Dalits are at the bottom. And what he was interested in was not inverting it, but laying it horizontally, so where everybody is equal. So that's the approach I think we should take. We with the 17% or 20% of population, it would not be just justifiable suggestion that we become the ruling class as opposed to these 15 or 10% upper caste being the ruling class. We should all be horizontal. And then the question will be, what will be the structure of the government? And then the government could be the whole parliament, and it could somehow come to decision on various proposals or bills without a prime minister or without any minister. So everybody would be equal. Of course, it would take a long time to elaborate on that, but that's the approach I think we should have in mind. And that's all that I wanted to convey here. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm sorry I joined the meeting very late during only the question and answer period, and I didn't hear the whole speech of the gentleman, the speaker. I forget his name. Sorry, but I wish I had heard the whole thing. Thank you. Thanks a lot. Bye. JaiBhim. Namo.
Satyanathji, this lecture is available on the YouTube, so you
Okay.
can watch that. Yeah, and
All right.
we will post. We are posting the link here if you wanted to, or I will send it to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, Harita, you may please close now.
Thank you, Sanjay. Thank you so much today, Jayaseelan, for being here and for all the participants so that we are able to engage in this meaningful discussion. The Boston Study Group tries to inspire positive changes in our society. Whether you're a scholar, activist, student, or a citizen, your presence and participation is invaluable in furthering Dr. Ambedkar's vision of more just, equitable, and inclusive world. On behalf group, I would like to extend a heartfelt gratitude for your participation in today's Ambedkar lecture. We hope that the knowledge shared during the lecture has inspired you. If you have any questions or need additional information also about the Awakened BSG Digital Magazine, please contact us at the email address. It is posted in the chat as well. We look forward to welcoming you to future events. Thank you again for today and have a wonderful rest of the day.